One of the elements of the film Black Panther by director Ryan Coogler that especially caught my attention when I first saw it and that I've gone back to time and time again is the idea of what it would mean for an African American director who has been versed in the graphic novel series of Black Panther as well as the Marvel movie series, the Avengers and all the other ones that have led up to the production of Black Panther in the Marvel movie series, is what could an African American director say in relation to Africa as a whole, Africa as an idea, Africa as a symbol, and especially the ways in which Africa functions as a symbol of homeland and of a return to some kind of unity, some kind of primal togetherness that was shattered after the days of slavery in terms of being brought over in slave ships and current day forms of slavery in the American prison systems and so on. In the days of Black Lives Matter movements in response to the killing of African Americans in the streets by police officers, what can a movie grasp that can offer some kind of hope and a sense of cultural integrity to current day African Americans in a medium of popular culture such as the adventure hero film that we get in all the Marvel series? So in a way very similar to the development of the specifically African American holiday Kwanzaa, developed in the 1960s at the height of the Black nationalist movement in order to give African Americans a place for some connection to ideas about traditional African spiritual heritage and not a continuation of subjugation to Western spiritual traditions that had dominated African American culture for the past several centuries. Kwanzaa was deliberately designed as a holiday that would celebrate in a Pan-African way the roots of all African Americans. And in a very similar way, when Coogler approaches the question of Africa in Black Panther, when you take a look at the costume, for instance, we see elements from many different tribal contexts that are brought together in a certain kind of quilt, a certain kind of mosaic in a sense. And then we see references to different habitations and market days and so on that we would find in various places throughout the continent of Africa. This relationship between the African American narrator and the mythical African story gives us a series of interesting questions that I'm not prepared to answer fully, but do want to begin to explore with you. It is certainly refreshing to see a reversal of the stereotypical portrayals of racial power dynamics and cultural representation that we see in the West as most familiar in our lives, and especially in Hollywood depictions. And we see this reinforced time and time again in Oscars and Grammy Awards and so on. In the movie Avatar, for instance, we saw the age-old opposition of civilized versus primitive replaced by a more recent opposition between indigenous wisdom and Eurocentric scientific positioning of self-perception, of self-being. Even so, Avatar is still marred by its reliance on the stock adherence to the white savior complex narrative of the typical heroic saga. Here in Black Panther, on the other hand, we are to imagine that we see things from the perspective of the so-called native in this story, rather than that of the invader. We are now immersed in African American fantasies of African roots and heritage. A question remains, however, are we still in a primarily Western mindset, and one conditioned by the superhero genre in the film industry, despite having a black director frame the narrative here? While the cultural hybridity of the African mosaic that Coogler presents us with gives us a refreshing break from the more standardized white supremacist depictions of cultural difference, We nevertheless still get a view of Africa that centers on, for example, rural rather than urban traditional cultures, despite the fact that this rural world is here framed in an Afro-futurist fantasy of some superior technological wonder of Wakandan science, an accident from the meteor that happened to land right there in the center of Africa and remain hidden throughout the centuries. As an avatar, we witness what to us appear to be magical scenes of healing and spirit migration to the other world of the ancestors. The healing takes place within a futuristic technological frame, while the shamanic portal passages remain indebted to the spirit journey tales of all traditional cultures around the globe. We might even say that Shuri, for instance, as the no-nonsense scientist of Wakanda, shares more with Dr. Grace Augustine in Avatar than with the shaman queen Moat. What we don't see in Black Panther, that I see as perhaps the primary saving grace of Avatar, no pun intended, is the sense of energetic communion with the forces of the planet that give rise to the multiple forms of Sahelu in Cameron's fantasy. Except for an extremely brief mention that the vibranium energizes the plant life in Wakanda, all of the other relationships that we see between the human and mineral worlds should still be seen as exploitational. This is something we do see in Coates's depictions of the brutality of the Wakandan mining operations. One could argue that the fact that vibranium has its origins in outer space precludes a sense of our having such a family relationship with the mineral in the ways that the Na'vi do with their unobtainium. But this displacement through space, and I mean space as in outer space, but also a spatial relationship that distances us from a sense of proximity that we often associate with relationship, forecloses the larger perspective that would see everything not simply in our homeland or on our own planet, but throughout the cosmos as part of our divine heritage and lineage.